Insert multi-mesh brushes, or IMM brushes, are brushes that contain a number of meshes inside them that can be dragged out onto your base mesh surface for a variety of different uses. You can use IMM brushes to build up or subtract from a Dynamesh surface, to create new subtools using splitting, to add details like teeth or mechanical greebles to your models, or to kit bash an entirely new model together from the meshes that are stored in the brush. There are several insert multi-mesh brushes that are preloaded in ZBrush. If we hit B to bring up our brush selector and I to isolate to any brushes that start with the letter I, we see on here that there are a lot of brushes that start with the three letters IMM. This stands for Insert Multi-Mesh. And you can see the ones that are preloaded into ZBrush when you start it up. We can also hit the comma key to go into our light box, go up to the brush menu, and in here there are more Insert Multi-Mesh brushes in this folder here that you can load at any time. Let's go ahead and load one of the preloaded brushes. We'll hit B and then I to isolate our Insert Multi-Mesh brushes. And we're going to start with one of the most basic of these, the Insert Multi-Mesh primitives, which you access by hitting the letter T. There's also a Insert Multi-Mesh primitives H. These are open-ended meshes that we'll use for mesh fusion in a later chapter. But for now, we're just going to pick Insert Multi-Mesh primitives. When you access a Insert Multi-Mesh brush, by default, you're going to see a new row appear up on your top shelf. This contains all of the meshes that are stored within this brush. You can scroll back and forth along this bar to see the different brushes, and you can store quite a few more than what we see here. To use an Insert Multi-Mesh brush, all you do is select from one of the meshes that are stored within the brush along this top bar here. Then click and drag on the part of the model that you want the mesh drawn out to, and release your stylus. And you'll see that our new mesh has been dragged out onto this surface, and the rest of the model has been masked off. This allows you to make changes to the model, such as switching to your gizmo and moving it around, rotating it, or even using other brushes, such as the Move brush, to change that mesh that you just placed down. I can also use splitting under Subtools, and I can use split to unmasked or split to masked points to take this mesh and put it into its own subtool. I can also select different instances and continuously drag out different models, or I can pick the same one and drag it out over and over again. And you'll notice that as I do this, the previous ones are masked, and only the new one that I drag out is left unmasked. If I want to drag out several instances of a mesh at the same size, what I do is first set my draw size, and then as I drag out a mesh, hold down the Control key to snap it to the size of your brush. Then I can repeat that same one, and if my draw size hasn't changed, that mesh will be the same size as all of the other ones that I dragged out before it. Now as I drag out a mesh, ZBrush will orient that mesh to the surface normal of the vertice that I start from. If I hold Shift after I start dragging, ZBrush will then constrain the mesh orientation to the closest world axis plane based on the view that I'm on currently. This can be useful if you want to drag out several parallel meshes, but you're dragging out from an initial vertice that's not at the same angle. Another thing I can do is click and drag in. Before I let up on my stylus, I can hold down the space bar and then move my model along the picture plane and change its position. Then let up on my stylus to drop it onto the surface. We can change the proportion of the mesh that's drawn out in a couple of ways. The first way is that if we click and drag outward from a vert, then go back inwards toward that vert, ZBrush will maintain the depth that we were at when we changed our direction, but will compress or scaled back in the other two axes. The other way we can affect the proportions of these meshes that we drag out is by changing the Z intensity. By default, it's usually set to 100, which will make it the same proportions it was when the brush was made. But if we change this to a lower number and drag out, you'll see that the depth of the model becomes proportionately less than the original model. Another way I can modify the mesh that is being drawn out onto our base surface is by using the projection strength slider located in the brush menu. To access this, I'm going to go over to the divider here on the left side and double click it to open our left tray. And by default, the brushes menu should already be located in it. Then if I open up the modifiers palette, the projection strength slider is located right here. I'm going to reduce the Z intensity of the mesh that I'm drawing out here a little bit, so it's a little easier to see the effect that we're going to get here. If I draw out an instance of this pipe and let go, and I rotate underneath, you see that this mesh is kept flat, even though the surface that it's being drawn out on is a spherical one. If I go to our projection strength slider and increase this to 100%, and then click and drag onto our mesh, and when we rotate underneath, we see that what ZBrush has done is conformed our mesh to the spherical surface that it's being drawn out onto. This is particularly useful if you need a form or detail to be molded to another surface. So let's lower this Z intensity even more so we can see this effect stronger. You can see here that it's taken this form and molded it to the spherical base mesh underneath. If I turn on our polyframes, when I click and drag out a mesh, it's going to have an assigned polygroup to it. If I drag out more instances of the same mesh, each one is going to have that same polygroup. A different mesh in the same brush will have a different polygroup assigned to it as well. You can actually have multiple polygroups assigned to an individual mesh. If I switch brushes, B, I, and let's grab the IMM clothing, and we'll drag out this mesh here, you can see that there are actually two polygroups. This allows these parts to be separated more easily from each other. Next, let's take a look at how we can use Insert Multi-Mesh brushes in conjunction with Dynamesh to create new forms on our model or even subtract areas from it. So let's start off by adding some antenna to our mantis creature here. I'm going to start off by adding some insert spheres to create the base for our antenna. Click and drag, and then when it's about the size that I want it, release. I'm going to hit W to go into our move gizmo and adjust the depth inward so that it fits inside of that little socket there. Then I'll go back to draw and insert a cylinder. Let's have it at a little bit of an angle. Okay. And I'm going to switch to move. And I want to do two things here. I want to increase the length of this. I also want to make the depth go into the sphere a little bit. So let's start off by moving that down just slightly. And now if I try to increase the scale along the depth, what we're going to see is we're going to get this distortion. And the reason for that is by default, ZBrush is going to be scaling along world axes. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over to the right shelf, and there's this L sim button here, and that means local symmetry. That's going to make things scale along the local axis of each object. Now when I click and drag on this, we get the expected behavior. So I'm going to bring it out about to there, and then I'm going to switch to my move brush and start to get, let's make that a little bit narrower by using smooth, and we'll drag it in. And let's just increase some of this form here. Make it a little bit more interesting. And that's pretty good. So I'll switch back to my insert multi-mesh primitive, grab another cylinder, click and drag out until it's about the size I want. Switch to the move brush this time, and we'll just set this in here, smooth that edge out a little bit so that it's not such an abrupt corner. Drag that inside of my other mesh, switch back again, drag out another one, and let's adjust that length, make it a little bit, just a little bit longer. Okay. Switch back to move, and I'm just using the hotkeys for these BMV for move and BIT for my insert brush. That way I don't have to go back to the brush selector every time I want to make a change. Let's go ahead and go back to our primitive brush, and we'll insert a couple more here. Let's do one last part here. I'll switch back to my primitive brush, and we'll add a insert sphere to the end. I'm going to click and drag that out, and then in this case I'm going to drag it out a little bit longer and then go inward so that it keeps the depth, but it gives me narrowed other two axes so that they're not, it's not spherical, it's more ovoid. Go back to move. And once we're happy with what we got, we can clear that mask. So now that I've got my antenna in place here, what I want to do is have the antenna as a separate object from the head or the mandibles. We're using Dynamesh groups down here right now. So what I can do is regroup these antenna pieces as a single polygroup and then Dynamesh the whole thing, and it will keep these as a separate mesh as long as they're a different polygroup than either of the other two. So I'm going to go ahead and hide, Control-Shift and tap on the head, Control-Shift-tap again to reverse that selection. Then we just have to hide the mandibles. I'll click on those. And now we have isolated just these antennae. I'll hit Control-W to make them a single polygroup. Let's make them a different one than that. That's good. And then bring everything back. And now we have Dynamesh on already, so all we have to do is Control, click, and drag on the canvas. And we now have our antennas as separate objects, so I can Control, Shift, and tap on them and still isolate them. But they have been Dynameshed together, and they're still part of the same subtool as the rest of our mantis head. If I wanted to, I could come down and split these into parts or similar parts if I want them on different subtools. I'm going to go ahead and do that. We'll do split to similar parts. So now we have our head, antenna, and mandibles as separate subtools. I'm going to go ahead and rename some of these. So we'll rename this antenna, and we'll rename this one mandibles. We can also use Insert Multi-Mesh to subtract from our meshes. I'll switch over to my Insert Multi-Mesh Primitives brush and select a mesh that I want to use to cut away part of this mesh. To do this, all I have to do is hold Alt, then click and drag on my model, and you'll notice a little bit different look as I'm dragging out. When I release up on my stylus, you'll see that the mesh looks a little bit different. This is because the inserted mesh has its normals flipped in order to show that it's a subtractive mesh. If you want to be able to see this better, what you can do is, in the Tool menu, go down to Display Properties and turn on this double button here. This displays both sides of the face of the polys. Then what I can do is go to my Move gizmo, move this up into position. I can also switch to my Move brush and change the shape of the inserted sphere a bit to make it look a little bit more like what I've got in my head. When I'm happy with the position of that, all you have to do to rerun Dynamesh is Control, click and drag on your canvas once to clear the mask. Then when you Control, click and drag again, the inserted mesh has been used to cut away part of the base mesh that it was dragged out from. Notice that ZBrush has assigned a new poly group at the intersection from our subtractive insert multi-mesh and our base mesh. Sometimes this is a behavior that you want, but when you're using Dynamesh groups, this can result in a problem when you remesh again and it tries to separate out this thin mesh from the rest of the base. So I'll come in here and do some smoothing in this area a little bit. And when I remesh this, you'll see now that we've got an issue here where we have two pieces of geometry on top of each other, and the resulting mesh will be a problem, especially if we re-Dynamesh again after this. So when you have Dynamesh groups on, you want to make sure that you're controlling your poly groups. So in this case, all I'm going to do is Control W to make this one poly group. Then I can remesh without an issue. We can also use this technique to cut holes through our model. So I'm on the mantis head, and I'm going to switch to Insert Cylinder. Then I'm going to come into a spot that I want a hole in, and hold Alt, click and drag, and then I'll actually go inward to make this a little bit thinner. And I'll switch down to Display Properties and turn on Double so I can see this a little bit more. Now currently this is buried inside of the mesh. When you Alt click and drag, instead of placing the mesh on the surface, it places it on the back face of the mesh that you drew out on. I'm going to go ahead and come into my Move and bring this depth up a little bit. Let's also rotate this so that it's sticking out on both sides here. I'm going to scale this up just a bit. Switch to the Move brush and adjust the position and shape of this form. And when I've got a shape that I'm happy with, all I have to do is Control, click and drag once to clear the mask, then Control, click and drag again to create a hole through our object. Now I'm going to smooth this out a little bit. Now you'll notice that the polygroups looked like they were the same. However, if I Control, Shift, and tap where the intersection was, it's still two separate polygroups. They just happened to come out to look almost identical. In this case, I'm just going to Control W to create a single polygroup again. We seem to be getting orange a lot here, so let's do that one more time. And that's how you can use Dynamesh and Insert Multi-Mesh brushes to create holes through parts of your mesh.